to our next new economy shortcut online series that we are running. We now today have a very exciting discussion in front of us, which is turning around one of our big issues that we have at our forum, and that we are asking, starting with the assumption that societies generally need something like a paradigm, something which is guiding politicians and media and so on, and where people believe in, and that this has been lost after the failure of whatever you call market liberal paradigm in the last decades. And since there's sort of a vacuum and a lot of thinking about what could be a new paradigm, what could be a new guiding line, what could be new policies, and there's a lot of new ideas and new answers. But one of the big issues that we have and the big challenges is to find a coherent, whatever you call it, narrative and coherent concept, which does not mean a model, one model in all details, but something which is combining a lot of new ideas and new guidelines, and it's something that we call a new paradigm. And that's why we've been very excited about something that we read recently, a paper that has been an essay that has been written and developed by Jakov, who's our guest today, on a designer economy. And he describes a lot of what we are thinking of what could be this new paradigm. So we were very interested in discussing this, if this could be part of a new paradigm and new guidelines. And we are doing this in cooperation with YSI, and we are happy to have Maria Schweinberger, who has accepted to moderate the session, to chair the session. And I will immediately hand over to you, Maria, and thank you for having accepted to moderate and to chair the session. And please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Thomas. I'm very happy indeed to be here and to share this panel on the stage with you and with Jakov. I'm a YSI veteran, and that's also how Jakov and I met. I think we go back up to 2014, maybe, where we met at INET in New York, when we were both PhD students. So currently I'm a capital markets attorney in London, and I advise private and public sector clients navigating the deep waters of the capital markets. And I also, like, I share my PhD, sort of my secret or clandestine PhD advisor with Jakov, which is Barry Merling, and that's kind of like how I came to YSI many years ago. So Jakov, thank you very much for joining us today. We're very excited to hear your and learn about your proposal, the designer economy, and hopefully then discuss it in this very intimate setting here then with our guests. And just by way of background, Jakov currently is the associate director at the Berggruen Institute in LA. And he's also an associate editor of Noema magazine, where he published this essay that we're going to discuss today. At the Berggruen Institute, he runs the program Future of Capitalism, which is basically also informing the essay. This program is informing much of the work that he had to do for the essay. And Jakov, by education, is a historian, and has done elaborate work on the Soviet Union and its history, and it mainly also its economic policies. So Jakov, I'll hand it over to you at this stage. If you, I think we're gonna try and stick to our timetable of 1 hour. So I'll let you introduce your ideas, maybe 15, 20 minutes. And then I'll ask you a few questions and then open it up to the audience. And the emphasis here will really be on the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you also, Thomas, Julia, New Forum, Jay Pocklington, who put all together, David, and YSI. And yes, I would not be here or be the person I am, I think, without YSI. I think, Maria, we go back to probably even before 2014. It's really, I think, has created a cohort of people, which I think is actually going to be a bit relevant to some of what I talk about. Just to re-emphasize, I am the associate director at the Berggruen Institute, where I basically work at the Future of Capitalism program, which is a fancy way of saying anything that touches economics. And by training, I'm a historian, not just of the former USSR, which is really for me a case study, but I'm interested in the history of economic thought, and particularly how economic thought influences policy. And a lot of my work, other than the USSR, has been industrial planning systems and industrial policy systems in general in the 70s and 80s, which I think kind of points to some things at the article that we'll be discussing. And what I decided to do with my 15 minutes is to kind of situate that article in a few of these broader contexts. Because the article, by its nature, first of all, was a collaboration, and second of all, was very American-centric. So you would get two different things if you got myself presenting the article versus my co-author and boss, Nils, presenting the article. I'm going to focus a little more on the broader economic thinking. Nils is going to focus a little bit more on the kind of, I guess, vision, because Nils is at his heart a former marketer, right? And he came up with the term design economy, which I don't think is an accidental term, but I want to kind of unpack it a little bit. So let's see, where was I? I'll start with the fact that this is a very American-centric article. And the goal of that part of it was both political and also somewhat intellectual. What we decided to do when we started thinking about writing up an article that's been kind of summing up about 3 months of us observing the world and discussing it between each other and thinking what our agenda is going to be in these changing times, we noticed that there is a very strange confluence around this idea of industrial policy, especially in the United States. And that, like in American history in general, there are these kind of moments of paradigm shifts within the political. As Nils would argue, as an American historian, I think that's generally true. There are these moments of coalition. You have the New Deal coalition, the post-New Deal coalition, the neoliberal coalition, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these are actually not moments in which there is political agreement within American politics. In fact, exactly the opposite. But that within these moments of, historiographically, usually backward looking coalitions, there is disagreement about an area, some policy areas that everyone agrees upon. So for example, in the post-Reagan moment, there is a general agreement by both parties about deregulation and about the erosion of the welfare state. But what that looks like, what the particular aims and goals of that are very different and create very, very dramatic politics. So with the rise of this kind of these coalitions that we described in the article, we really did think we're doing a bit of contemporary history where we kind of, if Nils were here, he would make this analogy that I think is really neat, is that in many ways, Donald Trump was Jimmy Carter, in the sense that he was the last president of the old post-New Deal coalition before Reaganism, but in fact, many things he said, and many of the things we identify, bad and good, with Reagan, started under Carter. And you could say the same thing about, the return of dirigism, of a more dirigist view of the American economy. It starts under Trump in its negative ways, but it doesn't work, but it is indicative of a shift in American elite thinking. And part of that shift is caused by Trump himself, because everyone is realizing, well, this kind of work towards this kind of Obama idea of tweaking the neoliberal model, making it more European, and actually in some ways, which I will get back to, it won't work, not in the United States. So both parties have to kind of come up with something new, or else you get a Trump. Now, why we settled on the term design economy, I think is pretty interesting. At first, this is a Nils invention again, and I'm the economist, so, or at least somewhat of the economist. So I was like, well, what does this mean? I think there's actually kind of a lot of interesting things behind it, because coming from the background he does as a design, is basically a historian of institutional design. Design does imply something, as we kind of indicate in the article. It implies a capabilities approach to doing politics rather than a specific goal setting approach, which is the aim of politics, you know, of the political. But in our kind of world, and this is something I believe actually that gets discussed a lot in the military and in the Pentagon, and I'm not the specialist on this, but the term design is, here are some, essentially is a creation of tool options at which then executive decision makers point the tools. And for them, the goal of, you know, the military in a democratic society is design tools to then allow, you know, political leaders to decide how to execute the tools. Whether that's true or not in practice is, I think, quite not. But I thought it was an interesting idea when it was brought to me. So we kind of, you know, convoluted around this term. And I think it's a neat term because it really does talk about the rest of the article, which is what I would much rather talk about, because that's, I'm much more comfortable with, honestly, than day-to-day kind of political coalition makings, which is a kind of, all right, if we agree on that this is the new terrain of struggle, say politically, then what tools do each of these coalitions need to achieve goals? And maybe that is where I think something that the American state might be interested in moving towards, if, you know, we're optimistic. I'll add that the idea to me as a historian is very familiar, and I've written about it in my you know, academic capacity. This is a discussion that came out of actually, you know, the OECD, Club of Rome, RAND in the 70s, that kind of milieu, so to say, about the failure of kind of hardcore interwar 50s, 60s economic planning as being too rigid, and that the idea of a plan or a development strategy should be mostly about not one future scenario, but self-updating, very loosely held futures and tools to identify those and paths toward them, rather than a very normative kind of decision system. And that work was really emphasized by a Turkish-American academic called Hasan Özbekan, and his work has been pretty useful for me in thinking through this. And it was kind of interesting that someone I read in my, you know, PhD dissertation at primary source kind of starts to, you know, as a historian, starts to influence you in the contemporary moment. So that's introing the article. I'd like to use the rest of my time to kind of draw out what it might mean and what might be useful for this audience, which is more European and also maybe more professionally economically interested in the economics. So first thing, and this is almost a boilerplate, I do a lot of work now, and we're trying to work on EU-US dialogue in this area. And, you know, as I said to some of you guys when we were coming in, it is very strange that, you know, there is this dirigist turn in the United States, this more possibly statist economic turn. And that's something, you know, popularly associated with the European side. And I think that's because there is a misunderstanding on the two parties about how our two systems work. I've been kind of coining this as that Europe does industrial policy through welfare policy and through the welfare state, including, you know, capital labor agreements that allow for a profit rate through a very powerful export-driven economy. The United States does welfare policy through industrial policy and through the jobs market. So we are very under-unionized. Our unions are chaotic. They are unevenly spread. We don't have a formal welfare state that is very big for many reasons, most of them pretty dark, honestly. On the other hand, the American state really, since its foundation, has been incredibly good at one thing and one thing only, which is sparking massive amounts of fixed capital investment and using that to create a tight enough job market to make at least some of the functions of welfare run through employment. And I think one of the things we've learned over the Obama era, especially when talking about climate policy, which in the Obama era was very much based on trying to do European neoliberal policies like carbon taxes, and even, you know, the Obamacare is very much based on this like idealized post neoliberal reform European healthcare system. Is that's not going to work in American political tradition. So many people went back to the drawing board, and we started talking to our trade union friends between the climate community and the trade union community, which, as I understand, is not a dialogue that started in Europe yet. And we realized that, you know, to get something across the board, we're going to have to come back to a very old tradition in the United States, which is industrial policy, and particularly an industrial policy through overcapacity and through the management of bubbles, because we are trying to build a green bubble in the United States. And we're very good at writing off bubbles. Because our bankruptcy code is extremely flexible. That's just built in. That aside, I do think this is an interesting moment intellectually and for new economic thinking beyond this kind of historian's view about what we are going through. I think we went through a kind of, after 2008, I think we went through I would say a Keynes moment, or at least somewhat of a vulgar Keynes moment, in which we have, us post-Keynesians, and I do use that flag, and I think most of us are sympathetic to that broadly, have kind of won a struggle in that we have said, okay, finance matters, financial markets matters, they are unstable, they are Minskian. And that's been our focus. And we've won that war to some degree. I think now we're in a different moment, which is still Keynesian in my opinion. It's still in Keynes. It's definitely in Minsky, but it is not as clear to me that we are in, it's not as clear to me that we've gotten a name for it. Jan Kregel has made a distinction in the 90s in an article about it between defensive and offensive Keynesianism. So offensive Keynesianism is when we're in a slump, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's like, oh, we need to do fiscal, budget constraints aren't there. They're, you know, they are, you know, inflation constraints. Now we're in a moment where we might not have a slump. We have a lot of money coming down the pike. In the United States, we're looking at $1.7 trillion about in green investment, because the way IRA was calculated, well, first of all, does include several other bills that were passed. Second of all, some of those tax credits are tricky. We, as I said, do things to the back door of the tax system. They are uncapped. That was designed to look smaller than it is. It's massive money. And now the challenge is how and where exactly to spend it in order to get the most effect out of it and to run an economy on an optimal growth path that doesn't hit inflation or deflation. And that is kind of the defensive Keynesian moment. And that requires very different institutions, as we suggest in the article, than what we have now. And just to close, I think that, you know, if Keynes was the this is in Keynes and Minsky, I can get into that in questions and answers, and it's even in Perry's system. But if there is an economist for the moment that is, I think, and I've just finished writing something on this, that is going to be what we are talking about and what we're grappling with, including the holes in his thinking, it is going to be Wassily Leontief and input-output analysis as a kind of microstructure of understanding what supply systems need to meet demand. So our kind of challenges, I would say, in this design economy is that we have multiple future demand scenarios we might want to get to, and we need to be able to think backwards about whether the supply side will be catching up just due to market signals or not. And I don't think it will, and that will require a kind of loose hand information sharing and creation system that, you know, Leontief and others by the 70s and 60s thought was missing in many Western industrialized economies. And as he would say, you know, this kind of intervention won't stop current inflation, but it will make future inflation much less likely. because we will be what we called clearing bottlenecks. We'll have a bottleneck detective in place to get us to the future we want to design. So I hope that kind of contextualized the piece, contextualized how I'm thinking about contemporary problems, and generally where I think we are in this paradigm of future design backwards resiliency building, which is, I think, you know, as I understand it, really resiliency rather than competitiveness is now on the minds of many people in DC. And it's something I think, especially speaking to your very European audience, I try to emphasize a lot, is these are not competitiveness actions. We don't think in terms of competitiveness in the United States very much, outside of some, you know, cosmopolitan, high economic communities. We do tend to think about system resiliency a little better. And this is kind of the spirit I think we are working in, and it is very true to the American historical tradition, as Nils and I would argue.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much, Yakov. I'm going to kick it off with some general sort of big picture questions, and we'll ask you to comment, and then I hope the audience will jump in and can show their faces, and we'll come to a nice discussion here. So I must say, when I first read the article, design economy made me think of artificial intelligence and some sort of, you know, futuristic and very sort of, you know, free will and self-determination sort of were the implied concepts that I expected in the first instance. So first of all, when we talk very concretely, talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, can you contextualize a little bit what the big coalition that you and the moment of coalition that you see in the Inflation Reduction Act? Can you describe that a little bit, especially for a European audience, sort of how you see what the agreement and what the disagreement as reflected in the act is, and also what the implications are now for the implementation of the act, right? The act was passed and is now being implemented, and as you said, there's massive amounts of monies coming down, but just contextualize the whole coalition building a little bit. Another question that I would have is, you described, you know, we're doing industrial policy through welfare policy in Europe, and in the US that we're going the other way around. What does that actually mean in terms of, you know, challenges right now when we say, for example, the goal is building resiliency, and how would we? Are you trying to say that this should be rethought, or is this a given that you're accepting? Okay, this is how the system works in the US, and this is how the system broadly works in Europe, and now we're building on this. And what does it actually mean in concrete policy making terms? And then you mentioned that, I mean, we're thinking about which institutions do we need today, right? So there's a national level here, right? Or say like a US element and a Europe element, but how can we take this to the international level? When you think about the IMF and the World Bank, have you thought about basically taking it a step further here? Okay, I'm gonna stop here. I'll have other questions, but I'll hand it back to you, and we'll follow up in a little bit.
All right, that's a lot of questions on,
yes.
on the design thing in AI. Well, we are based in California. We're surrounded by this stuff. By the standards of, I feel, where I work, where I think there is a lot of optimism about AI, I'm actually a skeptic in many regards. I do think it'll have an impact, but it'll mostly have an impact on people like us who play with spreadsheets and R code all day, rather than, you know, people who have real jobs that involve like putting things together, because, you know, we speak to people in robotics, which I have a few friends in for social reasons. This is a bit of a sidetrack. And they're like, well, our main challenge is getting a robot to effectively fold a sheet. We're nowhere close to, replacing most blue collar jobs that are highly labor intensive. But, maybe we are a little better at getting spreadsheets to require less people to enter stuff into them. That's kind of the impression I get on that. But the term to me is like, it also comes from the fact that I love John Dewey and the American pragmatist philosophical tradition of this idea of society as a kind of experiment. And that society emerges through kind of experimental action, kind of get feedback from that. And I think design is kind of how I at least thought about it this way. But yes, the whole California nonsense, and I do say that in the most lovable term, has leaked into our language, especially given that most of the other than me, most people I work with are people who work with Silicon Valley on one level or another, skeptically so, but still with Silicon Valley. So the IRA thing, and I also think you have to include the CHIPS Act with some of these issues. I'm going to kind of group them together because they are useful contrasts on some level, and I think just generally can say a lot of things. So I'll start with where IRA started from and what coalition it is. It is very much a kind of supply side liberal bill that was built in coalition, maybe with some of the social democratic coalition that we described. And I can tell you for a fact that things subsequently towards IRA, particularly fixing some of the permitting stuff in a way to advantage clean energy, didn't go through because of bitterness on one side of the coalition. Justified bitterness, as I can say. IRA is a smaller version of a much more radical bill called Build Back Better, which was supposed to do both the European welfare state system and the American industrial policy system. We were only able to get one part of that. And that's unfortunate, I think, but it is what it is. Honestly, part of what this article was about was dealing with that. Where I do think IRA is a useful story about coalitions and how politics has changed, especially from across the Atlantic, is you have to put it in a longer context. The first American climate change bill was something called Waxman-Markey, which was written in 2009. And it was a traditional cap and trade carbon bill. And it came very close to succeeding. A lot of these things are contingent, but it just didn't really have the firepower to get through. And one of the reasons for that lack of firepower, I would argue, and a lot of really smart people who kind of did the postmortem on it, was that it did not have traditional labor support. Or it had a lot of labor support, but it was very lukewarm. It was very unevenly concentrated. You didn't have a lot of labor allies in the United States, and you have to understand labor in the politics in the US are very different than Europe. We don't have sectoral bargaining. Our unions are both extremely strong in some places and extremely weak in others. So they're I can get into that a bit. They weren't really on board. So in the years between Waxman-Markey and IRA, a lot of very, very, very hardworking people went to the drawing board. And, you can look up some of these groups like the Blue-Green Coalition, which has, I think, done extraordinary political work on this. And, really worked hard to bring the traditional Democratic Party coalitions behind some kind of climate bill. And one of the things they realized is cap and trade isn't going to work. There is a great distrust in the trade unions in the US on, programs that are generally designed for reducing unemployment, particularly, industry change unemployment, rather than very specifically. And that what we would need to build a coalition would be a bill that is broadly based across all energy sources, not just renewables. And I actually think that's a good thing. I'm sorry, the Germans in this audience, we can't build an all renewable grid. I know a lot of engineers in this area. I've done a lot of grid assessment in my day job. We're going to need either nuclear or geothermal, and we're going to be with gas for a very long time. because the alternative to that gas is going to be coal. There are just some industrial processes for the next 20, 30 years that will be gasified. And that's, I think that is a great challenge for a design economy bureau, is how to kind of scale and scale down very quickly through these technologies. That's just going to be a fact of life. And that is the bill that we decided we're going to write. We can't do tax cap and trade in the United States. That's never going to happen. What we can do is throw a lot of money at a lot of things and see what sticks. And that is the coalition that got us IRA. IRA was, on the tactical level, no one really knows how it happened yet. That's for the history books of how we got those 2 votes to move. But I will tell you, a big part of that was getting the United Mine Workers on board, the coal mining unions. And that was because we had an industrial policy bill, not a cap and trade bill. That's just a factor of American politics. I think that gets you to your other questions on this welfare versus industrial policy divide. Ideally, we do both. That's my ideal. Quite frankly, we can learn a lot from how European labor systems are set up. We can learn a lot from having a normal welfare state, which would supplement industrial policy incredibly well, as we argued during the Build Back Better phase. We didn't get that. And a lot of this is a postmortem, as I'm thinking through why, and I do think it's because of these long political trajectories. To get to the difference, European labor, as I understand it, is greatly underpaid and has a lot more wage restraint and a lot more willingness to accept uncertainty because of the fact that there is a safety net, because of the fact that wages are bartered across industries. And because of that, you guys, as you know, Pettis and Klein, really, this is me getting in my Pettis and Klein soapbox. What the European side does really well is build extremely competitive industries, which don't necessarily just serve a European market. Again, we have a different system. And, if you read your, history of American business for, your example, your Chandler, you'll see that American business is never very export oriented to begin with. We have a giant internal market. We have a chaotic labor system. We have a welfare state that doesn't exist, that was built ad hoc. Again, there are many deep historical reasons for that. Other than this very brief moments in the post-war era and maybe in the 19th century, and even then you only see it in a few commodities, the United States mostly serves an internal market. And because of that, we don't really emphasize competitiveness. We emphasize innovation and efficiency, and not efficiency in terms of product output. And that's just, for better or worse, how we are going to have to learn to live with one another and achieve mutual gains. And I'll get to maybe what that might look like, because I do think that on the international level, I think we can live in some ways with that. On implementation, so with all this money, it's very difficult. I'll contrast IRA with the CHIPS Act, because the CHIPS Act was not written through this very strange reconciliation process that only, for parliamentary reasons, only lets us modify a tax code of existing programs and just completely modify them into doing things that are completely different, versus CHIPS, which set up a de novo structure. So CHIPS has a coordinating program office. It has something called the CHIPS office in the Bureau of Measures and Standards. And that office is building a lot of formal institutional capacity as a chief investment officer, which we've never had before formally in the government since the 70s. It has, it can attach specific evaluation writers, et cetera, in a way IRA doesn't. IRA has created, as far as I know, a lot of difficulties within implementation because it's being done through the tax code. So now, one of the primary agency implementing IRA is the IRS, is the tax agency. And it doesn't know how to do all of this. So you're seeing a lot of Department of Energy people, Department of Commerce people being seconded to the IRS to help them, and vice versa. And it's a really kind of ad hoc, all of government effort. to kind of design these things. There's a lot of really interesting tax credits in IRA. For example, if you're, there's something called the direct pay tax credits, which, if, for example, if you are a municipal government or a state government and you don't have a tax liability, you can still take advantage of tax credits. They're just refunded basically as a federal grant into your checking account, the same way it would be if you were a private entity, but just getting a tax discount. That's incredibly powerful. There's still a lot of rulemaking and coordination trying to understand how that's going to work. On a higher level, there is kind of an attempt to begin to do some of the supply chain monitoring that we are, for example, doing some academic work on with Berggruen Institute within working groups, for example, the Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, others, about to understand, how do we phase this in? What are maybe some like bottlenecks and potentials? Like, these are real questions being asked with this much capital, fixed capital being formed. There are some gaps, I would say, in IRA that we're trying to figure out how to close. On the implementation level, for example, IRA completely missed metals, rubber, all the things that go into wiring that we're going to need a ton of. Just kind of, I can't tell you why. I have no idea. It fell to the wayside. It wasn't just someone forgot, I think, honestly, about those little problems. That's not being incentivized or coordinated within the IRA system. And that, for example, will worry me as someone very interested in these chains. So that's being worked through. On an international level, I do think there is room for coordination. I'm not sure whether we can do it for the IMF or the World Bank, but I do think, for example, the EU and the US should be, and any other interested parties should be talking about very specific supply chains, very specific industries in which we can co-work on expanding. And we should be creating some kind of international fund in that not only makes sure that these things are redundant across the Atlantic, for example, but also invests in the global South to include the global South into this specific kind of chain of planned supply chain. That would be really great. I don't know if the IFIs have the capacity to do this. I'm not even sure the Chinese can think in these terms yet, and they don't for many other reasons. And China specialists can talk your ear off about how they're thinking about it, which is apparently becoming much more like the IFIs because they're like, oh, they're now realizing their money is scarce too. But I think that level of planning on an international level, something I think that, Leontief wanted in the 70s, that UNIDO, unlike UNCTAD, was like interested in the 1970s, which is again, a historian in me coming out as things that, different other things that haven't come up in the historiography as much. All of those things I think should be on the menu. How to get there, I don't know. I wish.
Okay, thank you for these elaborate answers. I'm going to invite the audience to come in with more questions. I already see that Jay and Niels have put a question here. I think I'm going to read them out, or unless there's a way that you can come online and actually ask the questions live. If that's possible, I'd prefer that, just to get some more interaction, but otherwise, okay, I see Jay. And for the rest of you, please feel free to ask questions either here in the chat or live. There can only be interesting questions, and so please don't hold back. Jay, do you want to ask your question?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the forum, and thank you to Yakov for the great presentation, Maria for the moderation. It's a real treat to listen to you, Yakov, and to just see how you think about these issues. I'm really interested in this sort of capabilities approach that you're mentioning, because it is, as you said, the post-2008 crisis can be termed as a crisis of macro, but now we have a real micro problem on our hands that has to be rethought and recalibrated. And I think it brings in a lot of political economy that is so vastly different in different environments. I think this is definitely not one model that fits all here. I had the privilege to speak to you about this before, and I'd like to maybe get more on this, because this has stuck with me from a previous conversation we've had on this topic. And that is, obviously, we are rethinking this in the US terms, and you've talked about the US EU cooperation and other types of cooperations. But I'm really struck by something you mentioned earlier. I'm paraphrasing you, you said that actually geopolitical competition might be inviting cooperation, but not in the way that we think through these multilateral institutions that you've said, but more or less, the fact that US, EU might be really trying to integrate in a very different way, and then inviting other countries in this sort of space because there is a competition, a geopolitical competition elsewhere. That might spur this sort of this idea that you've had of geopolitical competition might spur cooperation. And that's been one of the big questions we've had, like how does cooperation actually get achieved at this international level? And that's it's ominous to everybody how this would happen through these multilateral institutions. Now we've see this also with recent comments by Lula and the development banks in Shanghai that's being set up. There might be these types of geopolitical capabilities that are being built up. And I want to just bring one more question in, which is about the difference between US, Europe, and other countries. And that is the capabilities approach obviously is one of technology and know-how and implementation. And then we also have the fact that the US situation is pretty interesting about the ample availability of capital. How is that capital also be able to be deployed in a sort of cooperative way, if you will, in this framework, if you will indulge me on this sort of idea? So I'll just keep it for there. Happy to come into the discussion later on as well.
Are we doing many questions? How are we doing this? Am I answering now, or do we want to take a round?
Niels, if you want to jump in and ask your question at this stage, that's great. Otherwise, I'm going to read it. So, Niels, okay, I see you coming online. Thank you.
Hi guys, sorry for first be promoted, I think. I just wanted to ask, thanks again, Jakob, for a super interesting talk and a great article. I just want to ask about the toolkit that's used for this designing and this planning. Like basically, I would argue that, I don't know, classical economic methods are maybe not such useful tools for this. So what do you see as the sort of toolkit beyond maybe the straightforward input-output analysis that you've used that's being used for this designing? Like, how do you manage this change? Thank you.
Let's go ahead and take these questions.
I'll start with Niels, the other Niels in my life, and not my boss. First, because I think that's like really, honestly, the most that's super interesting. I can tell you what I am particularly interested in is like, yes, we have IO. Yes, we have traditional network models. I think one of the problems we have is that these are all comparative statics in how they come out. So I'm writing a grant right now with a guy named Robert Lempert, who is he's a physicist actually by training, but he is most known for being the co-chair of the IPCC, and he's one of these, big wig Rand Corporation people. And he is, I think, the holder of the flames of something at the Rand Corporation that Rand's been thinking about for 40 years, called a methodology for organizing information under deep uncertainty. They called it deep uncertain decision-making under deep uncertainty models. And what these are is taking lots and lots and lots and lots of comparative statics together and sampling statics as essentially like sampling the statics as a data set rather than of scenarios, right? And getting input dynamically over and over with decision makers and stakeholders in the room, right? And running that. So they do these like Latin, these like Latin cube sampling systems. They're very mathematically complicated, and I'm sitting with textbooks and learning them, but I think that has a lot of potential to work. I mean, it has worked in very restrained cases, particularly with Robert. His work has been in helping water management agencies in the West work, because we have these unknown, non-statistically, non-statistically well neatly distributed sets of scenarios with water availability. So the question is for them is, how do you do contemporary infrastructure planning for water systems in that kind of world? And, it has been extremely successful. The same method applied to the same kind of method applied to some models that we've had for epidemiology during COVID crisis in California has actually been really good at predicting the ways of COVID so far and getting policy responses. So I think there's a lot of potential. We're kind of planning in the next few months to, ask for money for designing using an agency that combines IO network and DMDU modeling, and particularly how to integrate it into something like the Department of Commerce, given the fact that legally it's difficult. So it'll be an interesting few days conference. Stay tuned, at least. You'll probably be, knowing your research, you definitely probably be interested in coming to it. But this is kind of really cool. This is what I want to work on for the next decade of my life as a scientist, as a historian, as a policy person. We just are writing granting for it. Jay, much more complicated question because it's political rather than technical. So how do you deploy this internationally? There are a few ways. One way is, again, something my colleague and I are trying to grant out through in the Institute. We have some interest, a lot more interest here, actually, interested in the supply chain stuff, which is to see if we can use cities as political actors and create internet and figure out where municipalities across the north-south divide can pool their resources in the supply chain by mapping the supply chains they're in, and see where we can green. Some of this has successfully, the trial run of this was with a program between some cities in Brazil and Copenhagen in beef supply chains. I think our value added is getting more of these cases, having better decarbonization plans around these cases, and particularly thinking about ways of creating better ways to pool municipal finance internationally. That's one little project I'm working on, just as a project within the Institute. But, on the geopolitics and cooperation, as a historian, someone who was formally trained a historian of the Cold War era, geopolitical competition always winds up creating cooperation on some specific areas. And I think that's going to be true here, unless it turns into a particularly militarized, the war goes hot, which it could. But I don't think it will. I'm an optimist. And I think US-China competition is by nature going to eventually lead to some constrained areas of cooperation. And it'll also hopefully incentivize some self-motivated, capital deployment overseas. I really do hope we come back to the era of FDI and state-directed FDI to get again around the Leontief paradox. So Leontief is, I think, the man of the hour now, as I keep thinking, and one day I will write his biography. Again, if someone pays me to do it, or gives me the resources to do it with, and go to 12 archives. But I really do think these are, again, issues that are becoming much more real, that we haven't talked about for many decades, that are back now. Again, if we can't do it through the IFIs, I would like to see some kind of voluntary co-investment fund around, again, specifically important supply chains for decarbonization, for example, copper, for example, probably less so. I'm a bit more skeptical about this, lithium. These are going to have to be multi-source things, and they require massive amounts of capital investment that just isn't coming fast enough. And that is something we can very easily provide out of, the American government, given the dollar system. And given that, despite what Lula says, I think it's going to be around for a while, because I don't think, as Perry would argue, I don't necessarily think it's up to states what the dominant currency is. That is very much a market decision. And markets still love the convenience of transacting in dollars, and no one else is going to offer that convenience for a long time. Unfortunately, maybe.
Okay, before I I hand it over to Thomas, I want to encourage everybody to come up with questions and do it here in the Q&A chat or by direct message to me. I can read it out. Yeah, would love to have a few more questions. Thomas, please. He may have just frozen. Is that?
Yeah.
There you are. Okay, please go ahead.
Problem. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's okay. It's coming in and out, but hang on, we'll be patient.
Hello.
Please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Don't have an idea why this is unstable today. Just wanted to ask you, Yakov, on your assumption that maybe in this historical terms and in this change, in this paradigm shift, Trump has been a first bad attempt, if I understand correctly. What is your take on the situation in the US and among Republicans and the general political situation? And are there real serious signs of a whole political spectrum, or at least most parts beyond the Democrats that are going into this new direction, something like a new paradigm?
So that's the $1 million question. I think there are green shoots. I think I can't get into details. My experience doing politics, which isn't that much because I don't do a lot of day-to-day politics, but when I have, I think, let me break this up into two questions. On the tactical level, I think there might be. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think there is a coalition that the Republicans have or might actually be able to access as they think. Many of them internally know that their policies aren't popular in that coalition. They don't have a lot of answers. There are national security Republicans that are sometimes willing to talk. There are a lot of these jobs, most of these jobs are being created in red states. And I think that party is in flux now, that happens. And they don't know where they're going. I can tell you for a fact that, the worst thing about American federal politics is the filibuster. Don't know if this audience needs an explanation of that. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads, so I think that problem. One of the defenses of the filibuster is that it encourages bipartisanship. I can tell you, this is the one thing I can tell you from my experience speaking to people on the Hill. That's an absolute lie. If it weren't for the filibuster, we would see many, many more bipartisan, I think, bills around industrial policy in particular, because you would see kind of bit of what I would say a roller coaster on that. And you've seen that before, like for infrastructure bills a lot, you'll see that, where just enough people crossing the line causes others to cross the line for a very popular policy, because it begins to look that it is passable. So if you have 52 votes, more and more, it will get to 60. But because 60 is the threshold, you can't get that roller coaster, because you can't take credit for it anyway, because it's not going to pass, even with a small majority. So that creates a very unpleasant political dynamic, to say the least, which is what we're stuck with for the time being. I think if we can unstick that dynamic, you are definitely going to see an industrial policy wing of the Republican Party that is self-conscious. Now, it won't be the industrial policy wing I want. It'll be very brown. It'll be very nationalistic, but it'll be there. I think but it's a structural problem. That's on a tactical level. I think in the long term, what I mean by Trump being kind of a breaking point is, it was I think there was a lot of self-delusion in the Democratic Party, Republican too, about very free market policies, or like the very conservative response to 2008. And then the 2015 crisis, which was a crisis in 2015 of the economy. I do think that there was a lot of self-reckoning after that by both parties, and trying to figure out how this is possible and where these key votes are. And these key votes, as I mentioned in the article, are in the Midwest. They are very traditionally working class votes. And I mean that not just in, this white working class BS, which is just like BS. The working class is very, very, very varied in the United States. There is a tradition, and there's a very famous article about this by Charlie Mayer, historian of Europe, about how the pre-World War II European working class was not in favor of welfare policies. They were in favor of owning the means of production and directing production. And then World War II killed them off, and welfare, European social democratic parties became more bourgeois and middle class, and thus the welfare state entrenched in many places. That attitude about being hostile to welfare policy, but very, very pro jobs policy, is definitely present in polling of that key swing electorate. So I think both parties are going to have to deal with that. That's just like a very consistent set of polling, as far as I understand, politically on this tactical level. And like, you poll what is more popular in the United States, especially in these UBI or a jobs guarantee, and the jobs guarantee, like, for whether it's a good idea or not, or economically feasible or administratively feasible, breaks any like UBI, overwhelmingly more popular. Like, the average American voter thinks everyone should be forced to work, and that job should be a really good job, and it should be very easy to get. But no one, but they're much more skeptical of quote unquote handouts.
Okay. Thomas, do you want to follow up? Otherwise, others, please jump in. Otherwise, I'll comment and ask a few more questions.
Yeah, if you have any, please go ahead. I mean, would be interesting to compare, and just a word, but that's something we will continue to discuss, to compare this.
Yeah, no, it's a
Germany,
fascinating political
have,
economy, and like
some
comparative
very clear political
politics.
parties would clearly undescribe and follow this line, but the big question is where the non-usual suspects are going. So, but that's just something to continue at another time.
Yeah, no, it's a really, we're at very much, I think, Thomas, you're right, like at this very strange, uncertain breaking point. But I do think like the sociology of this can really give us at least some broad paths to follow. And the sociology is very strange. I mean, like what I described, I think, is quite like where we are sociologically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And coming up and synthesizing the goal setting in your toolkit, right? That the goals that you will that you are setting, and then towards which you will apply the tools, right? In synthesizing the goal setting with the key votes and the democratic process that you just described, I was wondering whether the designer economy actually assumes that there will be always democratic means and democratic decision making. To me, as I read it, the designer economy actually would also work with a purely democratic, technocratic government. And I'm wondering whether this in itself is maybe a risk, or whether this is actually, actually a benefit, or like an advantage, that this type of toolkit could be used with any decision making in society, be it democratic, be it technocratic government. It's basically for the welfare of the subjects. So, yeah, do you want to answer directly? Otherwise, let
yeah.
me throw in a few other thoughts.
Good.
So one is on the decision making. Second one is an observation. You know, you mentioned U.S.-China competition, and then tying it up with what you said earlier. Okay, it's not so long, not much longer competitiveness, but it's resiliency that sort of drives us. So we have this competition at the outside, and in the inside, we're striving towards more resilience. It seems like, you know, 20 years ago, it was exactly the opposite, right? We were striving for more competition inside, and, you know, resilience was just something we assumed, or we were satisfied with, we're not necessarily sort of concerned with. And then on the war with Ukraine, you touched already, but how actually is that the war itself, right? How is that turning decision making in the US inside? Like, how is this? What's the working class, as you just framed it? You know, can it be swung by the war and the outcome of the war?
I'll start with the war, and then I'll go to the really cool broad democracy question.
Yes, thank you.
I don't know, the politics of the war in the US, like, I don't know, like the war is broad, like support for Ukraine broadly is fairly popular, like maybe overwhelmingly so, depending on the poll. In terms of what the US is learning from the war, you know, I'm not a military guy. I do have some military experience, but I'm not a military guy. My impression is like it is kind of being interpreted for better or worse by some in the military community, as I read in the news, as like going like, oh, do we have enough stocks? Do we have enough of a defense industrial base for this kind of war? And, you know, there's this like, oh, do we actually need hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of artillery rounds? And like, can we produce that and such? I think that's freaking them out. I don't know the answer to that. Like, I have no idea. Don't really know how to blow things up very well. But that has certainly like kind of made them pay more and more attention to stocks and sustainability. And you know, maybe you can learn a little bit about like stocks and reserves and sustainability for the civilian economy for that. That would be nice to think through. I've also heard counter arguments that everyone's over indexing to that war, and it's just because these are two armies that are fairly incompetent at doing anything, like that are both like relative shit shows and like incompetent at modern warfare. So they're kind of fighting in a artillery heavy stuff, like material heavy way that like wouldn't look like this if it were a different kind of armies fighting. I don't know. I'm just paraphrasing what I've read. Like in the news, like I literally have no idea, but like I don't know. But kind of where I do think it is interesting is like this idea of what I mean by competitiveness is specifically export competitiveness and export profitability, and like competitiveness across the large you know, scope of economic activity, rather than competitiveness as in like geopolitical competitiveness or something else. And what I mean about resiliency, and maybe this is kind of an undertone, maybe I should have made this more explicit, is that, excuse me, my voice is starting to go. The issue is like, again, if you over concentrate your supply, if you don't plan it explicitly and you plan it just for high efficiency to have lower overhead and high profits, if something goes wrong, if something doesn't go right according to plan, then you're going to see a price shock, as we've seen, and that'll propagate, and that'll be a pain in the ass, and there'll be all kinds of problems. So I think like what I mean when I mean resiliency is to say a system that can live with shocks a lot better and live with uncertainty a lot better. Now, the democracy question, which is actually really interesting. I think democracy is basically like, you can't have a system like this without a democratic input. And the goal of democratic politics is to set the goals, is to set the, you know, the wide scenario of futures. And the goal of a technocracy is to tell what it would take to get to those futures and whether we can bear that to take or not, or whether we need to think our futures. And that, to me, you know, in an ideal system would be a dialogue system in which the goal of a democratic society is both oversight and engagement with a technocracy within the state. And, you know, one of the problems with Soviet planning was, like, you know, that didn't exist. There was like there was a political mandate to do certain things, and that, you know, and the technocracy had to execute it whether it was possible or not, and vice versa. There wasn't really a dialogue between the technocratic side of the state and the political side of the state. And the political side of the state was stagnated and unresponsive because there was no like formal democratic mechanism to make social preferences, you know, possible or like legible. So you had a politics that was purely either hard like ideological, or just purely various faction or purely factional. And, you know, you can't have a functioning technocracy under those circumstances because the technocracy doesn't know what to do. It has no way of influencing the public. It has no way of dialoguing with anything. You know, whether formal representative democracy is the best way of getting at it, or where we need more direct democracy or better, you know, social dialogue, you know, that is a question, I think, for democratic theorists, of which I am not one. I have many colleagues who are, who I've been kind of like nudging to think about this. And, you know, we do have some projects on that. Like, for example, we would like to have some region, you know, if you read the papers we put out on National Investment Authority, the work we're doing at Berggruen on doing some consulting for like municipal investment funds, we would really, in an ideal world, like to see more public involvement in how those technocratic institutions are governed and what goals they work towards, right? Like, what do you emphasize? Because, like, look, if I have a limited set of funds, say for the city of LA for an urban investment fund, which I'd like us to have, that fund can be deployed towards all kinds of things. It could be deployed for improving housing availability. It could be deployed for business opportunities. It could be deployed towards electrification. All those are worthy goals. It is the job of a democratic public to tell it to set those goals. It's not the job of the bank or of the investment fund or whatever. I don't think it should be. They should inform the public. They should have an opinion. They should certainly be voices in this as a technocracy, but our job is to execute as much as it is to set.
Okay, I suggest that we do one more round of questions before we close. So I already have one question from Jay, and if there's somebody else, I would really welcome it, and please then come forward now and share your question with us. And
Yeah, thanks.
then, yeah, so Jay, go first, and then if somebody has appeared by then, but once they're done, then we'll let them speak also. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. I think the idea of that you had sort of mapping out bottlenecks and understanding where there might be binds in supply chains, or, you know, big shocks to strategic inputs. That is that's becoming more overt and more clear to everybody right now that that's a key thing. I'd like to maybe ask you if there's a way to shape the market through strategic stockpiles. We've seen some examples of this already. But I was wondering if you could speak to that, and to what degree, you know, that is not just a US only phenomenon, but whether this is, I think in Europe, we're trying to do something similar in terms of making sure there are, you know, bounds around what can happen in terms of quantity and prices. I was wondering how that sort of informs the idea of uncertainty and shaping maybe possible futures within those bounds that are there.
Oh yeah, we should definitely be thinking about that. That is like a very old Keynesian Herod toolkit that's underdeveloped. And I think, like, there's been some talk of a lithium reserve now. There's been talks about, you know, There's a strategic oil reserve. Whether in the US, I think there's been talk of a hydrogen reserve in Europe, which sounds like a very good idea. Though I am not necessarily, again, certain of where hydrogen goes as a technology. That's a question for technologists, not me. But it again is uncertain. But if it does work, and hopefully it does, I hope everything works. Maybe a reserve, it makes a lot of sense. In terms of pure economics of reserves, we're all Perry Marilling readers, or at least 3 of us here are Perry Marilling readers, and they work through the trainer model. To me, you can read them as if people aren't familiar with the trainer model is a model of a dealer, right? A dealer in anything. And the dealer's job is to essentially to make a profit. They set prices, and they set prices by trying to make a spread between supply and demand and managing their book. And all a reserve does in function, if you think about it, especially for a commodity, is to move that spread around, right? If there's too much of something, I think the reserve should be buying, and thus making sure that the industry continues to have certainty on a rate of profit, to continue making investments. If there's too little of something, the reserve should be selling in to make sure that there's no bottleneck. And the price comes from the dealer action. And, that's pretty straightforward economics. I mean, and then the question is, the question is, not everything is as fungible as money. And fungible. So as I've said, in many ways, my dream is that there is a Federal Reserve for everything. But obviously that's never going to happen, like a central bank for everything, a dealer of last resort for everything. But where we can, we need to really, I do think we need to think about that option. We really do. I think that's a great idea. I don't mention it explicitly, but if we can get there, then we should have more of it. It's a good idea. It always has been. And I think where it would be a really great idea, if, I could have my magic wand, it would be great as an international thing, as an internationally administered set of reserves. It would be wonderful. And, there we can think about Bancor and all the other wonderful future things that I probably will never see in my lifetime, but I wish I would. And I'm a pessimist in that regard. But yeah, that's been a dream for a very long time. Again, it's a dream. It was something we discussed in the last time the economy was seeing micro turbulence on this scale, which was the 1970s. And I think we should be discussing it now.
Okay, thank you very much. I can see, or I can hear that my question on democratic governance really struck at the core of the issue. When you're suggesting several or Federal Reserve for everything, for all kinds of resources. So, anyways, thank you everybody for joining this evening. Thomas, did you have any final words that you wanted to share with the panel and the audience?
I just want to thank Jakov, Jay, for cooperating and preparing and inviting. Very inspiring. I think that's in the midst of what we are thinking about, what we need to think about, and very, very helpful. And I think we will be in touch and
yes,
all this.
Yes, this is wonderful. Thank you for having me. I do let's stay in touch. I really, really kind of hope we put out somewhat of an agenda that we could all kind of think through and really figure out how to do, because no one knows how to do this.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much, Jakov. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Have a good evening and see you very soon, and stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.